All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Tyler Ospower, a current first-year student and member of the Lafayette Student Alumni Council, an organization dedicated to celebrating Lafayette's beloved traditions and educating the student body on the importance of philanthropy. I'd like to thank you for joining us for today's presentation, Beating Lehigh Through the Years. The students of LSAC and the entire Alumni Relations Department appreciates you taking the time out of your busy professional and personal lives to connect with Lafayette tonight. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. First, to ensure that the presentation is not interrupted by any background noise, please keep yourself muted for the duration of the presentation. We invite you to include your full name and class year on your profile, and we suggest that you turn your video off to avoid being on camera in the gallery during the presentation. We welcome questions and ask that you use the chat feature located at the bottom of your screen to type in any questions that you may have. Please know that this presentation will be recorded so that you and the rest of the Lafayette community will have access to it later. And with that being said, I'd like to introduce our speaker. Elaine Stomber is a member of the class of 1989 and serves as our college archivist in the Special Collections and College Archives Department of the Lafayette Libraries. She spent her early career as an archivist at the American Philosophical Society Library in Philadelphia and the Cloisters, the medieval branch of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York City. Elaine returned to Lafayette in 2000s to work with the college's manuscript and archival collections. She provides library instructions and research support for students, faculty, and administrative offices on campus, and is the proud parent of Claire, a member of the class 2017, and Julia, a member of the class 2021.
Thank you, Tyler, and to everyone who's joining us this evening. And in the absence of Lafayette College's most treasured tradition this fall, I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to share the history of our storied rivalry with Lehigh. We have 155 games already in the record books, so we do have a lot of football to cover. So I'm just going to jump right in and we'll get started. The first football game at Lafayette was played in 1871, and it was between the junior and the senior classes. The first intercollegiate football game wasn't played until November 7th of 1882, and that game was against Rutgers. I'm sorry to report that Lafayette was scoreless in our very first football game. We lost the only other football game that season as well, and that was against the University of Pennsylvania. But in 1883, Lafayette's first win is recorded, and that was against Rutgers, and the score was 25-0. And on this slide, you actually see that 1883 team, and this is actually one of the first football images that we have in the college archives. In 1884, it was a very key year for the future of sports at Lafayette. We finally built our first gym, which I'm sure from the slide, many of you will recognize is the current location of Kirby Hall of Civil Rights. But in addition to getting our first gym, we also began one of Lafayette College's greatest traditions. On October 25th of 1884, on what is today Lafayette's Quad, but then was just a muddy field in the middle of campus, Lafayette played Lehigh in football for the very first time. And believe it or not, this is actually a photograph of that first game. Lafayette had been playing intercollegiate football for 2 years at this point, but only 3 people on the Lehigh team had ever played the game before. So the final score is probably not surprising. It was 56-0 in favor of Lafayette. In the early years, Lafayette and Lehigh played twice a year, which is the reason that our rivalry is the most played collegiate contest in the United States. And the second meeting of the two teams, the following month in 1884, Lehigh did fare a little bit better, and they actually scored their first touchdown ever, making the final score 34-4 in favor of Lafayette. Our rivalry games were very contentious from the beginning of our history. In the very first game, the Lehigh center was ejected for rough play. The team protested that decision, and they refused to continue to play, and they left the field with a score of 0-0. And that game was later awarded to Lafayette. The second game that year was the series' first tie, 6-6. And Lafayette didn't get its first, or Lehigh, excuse me, didn't get their first victory until 1887. One of the bright stars of this first decade was Jake Camp, shown here as captain of the 1889 team. And he's the one holding the football at the center of this photo. Camp scored almost all of the Lafayette touchdowns against Lehigh during his years at the college. And here is the earliest Lafayette-Lehigh ticket that we have in the college archives. It dates from 1889. And although Camp went on to greater glory and All-American status at Penn after graduating from Lafayette, some of his best football was played for the Maroon and White. And for those of you who don't know, we were originally known as the Maroon and White. We didn't become the Leopards until 1924. In 1891, Lafayette finally hires its first football coach ever, W.S. Moyle. He was an Englishman and he was a graduate of Yale. And he had been a substitute on the Yale team while he was a student there. And it was thought that because Yale played such excellent football at the time, that it would be advisable for us to get someone who knew the Yale plays. Moyle not only coached, but he also played on our team at Lafayette as a graduate student. And apparently his favorite play was to carry the ball himself, which made Lafayette officials eventually decide against the idea of a player coach, and they let him go. In addition to the arrival of the first coach in 1891, it was also the year that there was an unprecedented 3 Lafayette-Lehigh football games. One was played in Easton, one in Bethlehem, and one was in Wilkes-Barre, the day before Thanksgiving, before a crowd of 3,000 spectators. The game was apparently organized as a neutral site to avoid favoritism. And this Wilkes-Barre game was the only time the game was not played in either Easton or Bethlehem until the 150th meeting at Yankee Stadium in 2014. In 1895, Park Davis arrived in Easton to coach Lafayette. He was the college's first great coach. Davis had played at Princeton, where he was coached by Woodrow Wilson. And then Davis went on to coach Calvin Coolidge. He instituted the pep rally at Lafayette, he invented cheers, and he composed songs, including Ring the Bells of Old South College. And after his coaching years, he became one of the great football historians. He was an authority on statistics and records, and he served for many years as the National Rules Committee for College Football. And he was the author of this great 1911 classic, Football, the American Intercollegiate Game. And Davis was at the helm during the controversial fall of 1896 when there was no Lafayette-Lehigh game. That year, Lafayette had played, it had one of its greatest teams of all time with a host of great players, and they all had very interesting, picturesque names. There was Babe Reinhardt and Stop Rowland and Kidney Bray and Rose Barkley. And the fact that Barkley had played baseball for the semi-pro Chambersburg team the summer before raised eligibility questions for Lehigh. Even though Lafayette steadfastly maintained that he had only taken money for his expenses, the two teams could not reach an agreement in time for the 1896 season, so the game was canceled. But 1896 was one of Lafayette's greatest seasons ever. Only a tie with Princeton marred the perfect season. And you can see the schedule and the scores on this slide. The greatest game that fall was with the very powerful Penn team, which Lafayette defeated 6-4. And with claim to the national championship, the team was honored far and wide. The Lafayette two-step polka was written for them. And a cigar, the Lafayette Stonewall, was named for them as well. And Theodore Roosevelt, who was then police commissioner of New York City, presented the team with a citation. One other note about this team concerns George Barkley. He was also known as Rose Barkley. And he scored all the points in the game against Penn. In 1894, Barkley worried about his cauliflower ears during the really rough games, and he had a harness maker create a headpiece with several strips of leather that would protect his head. And this was actually the prototype of today's football helmet. Although there were other claimants for the title, Barkley is generally credited with the invention of what ultimately became today's football helmet. And on this slide, you can see Barkley holding that first football helmet on the steps of Pardee Hall. After a year without a Lafayette-Lehigh game, the famous rivalry was very much back in evidence in 1897. This is actually the game ball from one of the two Lafayette-Lehigh contests that year. And the other game was also a shutout, 22-0 in favor of Lafayette. At the helm of the Lafayette football team from 1898 to 1902 was Dr. Sylvanus B. Newton, a Phi Beta Kappa physician who came from a coaching job at Penn State. Newton was a great student of the game and is credited with inventing the place kick. Newton spent 3 seasons at Lafayette in which we defeated Lehigh in all 6 of our meetings, and by wide margins. After the last of the 6 humiliations, when Lafayette beat Lehigh 41-0, Lehigh hired him away from us. And it was a smart move on their part, because in 1902, he coached the Engineers for a 6-0 win against his old team. Great seasons occurred during the Newton era, including the formidable 1899 team, which lost only 1 game to Princeton and beat Penn 6-0 when Kidney Bray ran for 95 yards on a kickoff. And Bray is the one in the stripes at the center of this slide. Another hero of this period was Walter Scrappy Bachman. He was captain of the 1901 team, and he's been called one of the greatest linemen in Lafayette history. Both Kidney and Scrappy were instrumental in helping the Maroon and the White rack up 6 straight shutouts over Lehigh in 3 seasons from 1899 to 1901. In 1902, Lafayette and Lehigh began to play each other only once a year. Crowds were getting larger and larger. And by this time, Lafayette was no longer playing on the quad, but rather on March Field, which actually used to have grandstands for spectators. And here's an early photo taken about 1897. And by about 1901, the field began to be universally called March Field in honor of Francis March Jr., who was a member of class of 1881. And that was because of his great contributions to Lafayette athletics. In the 1906 Lafayette-Lehigh game, the first forward pass ever used in the rivalry was thrown by Lafayette's Edward Flagg to spark Lafayette's shutout of Lehigh 33-0. And in the 1909 contest, Lafayette again surprised Lehigh with a so-called circus double forward pass, which I don't even know what that possibly could be. It was for 50 yards. It went from the quarterback to a tackle 18 yards behind the line of scrimmage, and then back 47 yards downfield to help clinch the win, 21-0, and another great season for Lafayette. In 1914, after several years of graduate student coaching with very unsuccessful seasons, the decision was made to bring in Wilmer Crowell as an outside coach. His first season starts well, but towards the end, the whole entire team is struck by typhoid fever. And the Lehigh game is lost by a string of second string men that they had to bring in to play the game. And this issue of the Lafayette newspaper focuses on the valiant efforts of that second string, as well as the well-attended smoker the night before. And smokers at Lafayette were huge affairs at this time. In addition to smoking, there were bands that were playing in between speeches that were made from platforms, college songs were sung, and cheers were made. And the freshmen were required to go to the smokers to learn about college football history. Freshmen traditionally played a significant role in the preparations for the rivalry game each year. And this photo of a bonfire on the quad comes from an alumni scrapbook in our college archives and bears the following inscription on the back. Before the Lehigh game, we fresh collected and hauled all this stuff for the bonfire, and we won the game. 1915 featured one of the greatest upsets of the rivalry. Lafayette snaps a 3-game losing streak against Lehigh 35-6. And to add insult to injury, Lafayette scored the first touchdown in our first game played against Lehigh in Taylor Stadium. And this was despite the fact that Lehigh paraded a casket across the field at halftime bearing the inscription Lafayette. Special trains were run from Bethlehem, Allentown, and New York City to Easton in 1916 for the 50th Lafayette-Lehigh game. And due to growing popularity of the rivalry, these special trains continued for many years on game day in Easton. The largest crowd ever gathered on March Field in 1916 to witness the 50th meeting. Unfortunately, Lehigh crushed us on our home field 16-0. And this newspaper clipping charts the disaster in great detail. The post-game celebration at Lehigh included a bonfire of such great magnitude, it could be seen 10 miles away from Allentown. Lehigh won the 50th game with the help of Bots Brunner, who kicked a 35-yard field goal after a touchdown. And if you just remember Bots for a couple minutes, because he's going to turn up in another story just in a couple seasons. So our Lafayette football program suffered during World War I as the college transitioned to a military camp. Nearly every football player enlisted in the Army, and several poor seasons followed. In 1917, Lehigh defeated Lafayette by the largest score ever recorded in the rivalry, 78-0. And then after that, it was suggested that all intercollegiate athletics be discontinued for the duration of the war because there was little time or inclination for organized sports. And as the editor of the Lafayette wrote, it was impossible to attempt to be loyal to Lafayette with a face turned to the east and only a half an ear for the call of the classroom and the campus. A game was played in the fall of 1918 while Lafayette College was operating as a military camp and during the Spanish influenza epidemic, but it involved teams of enlisted Army men who were stationed on both campuses, both at Lafayette and at Lehigh. But by 1919, students returned to campus, classes resume, and the resurgence of football is on the horizon. And the Lafayette coach who restores the maroon and white to their pre-war prestige is Dr. Jock Sutherland. After playing at Pitt under Pop Warner and a stint in the service, Sutherland had planned to begin a dental practice until a friend talked him into going to Lafayette and coaching. And during Sutherland's 5 seasons, from 1919 to 1924, he chalked up 33 wins, 8 losses, and 2 ties, 5 straight victories over Lehigh, and a national championship. In 1921, for the first time in its history, Lafayette wins every game played of the season and is called the best team in the country and earns its 2nd national championship. The Lafayette-Lehigh game was one of the most memorable games of that 1921 season. Winning 28-6, Lafayette clinches the national title. And this was the gentleman I asked you to remember from that previous slide. Bots Brunner contributes to Lafayette's big win against Lehigh that year as a member of the class of 1924. If you remember, he helped kick a field goal that helped Lehigh beat Lafayette in 1916. He was the only man to ever play for both teams. And he also did stints at Yale and Penn in between his time at Lehigh and at Lafayette. In 1924, Coach Jock Sutherland decides to return to Pitt, and G. Herbert McCracken, also of Pitt, is hired to replace him as head coach. He was only 25 years old when he came to Lafayette. Excuse me, I hope I can get through this without coughing. I'm sorry. He was, 1 second. Okay, we'll try this again. McCracken was only 25 years old when he came to Lafayette, and he was an inventor of plays and a master of spring surprises. I'm sorry, I'm losing my voice. He coached Lafayette's football team for 12 seasons from 1924 to 35 and guided the Leopards to the 1926 national championship with a perfect record. And another important note about the 1920s, it was during this decade under coaches Jock Sutherland and Herbert McCracken that Lafayette won every game of the rivalry except for the final year in 1929. And here are two of our best players from this time period who helped us beat Lehigh 9 times out of 10 during the 1920s. Let's go back to them for a second. So Frank Dutch Schwab was class of 1923, and he ranks with Charlie Reinhardt as one of Lafayette's finest linemen. He was named twice as an All-American in 1921 and 22, which was really rare for a player from a small college at this time. And Schwab almost rejected college in favor of working, but Coach Sutherland, who recruited him, remembers that for the first month, it was almost a nightly occurrence to have to persuade him to stay at school. He was a defensive powerhouse on the 1921 national championship team, and in 1958, he became the first Lafayette player inducted into the Hall of Fame of the National Football Foundation. And Charlie Berry, who's at right, was class of 1925, and he had exceptional ability to work his way through interference and as a field goal kicker. He was inducted into the Hall of Fame of the National Football Foundation in 1980. In the 1920s, the need for more modern athletic facilities really became pressing. And this is a great photo of the old spectator stands on March Field. And at first glance, you may think it's the wrong campus and wonder about the building that's in the background because it is March Field. But as we saw earlier, that's actually our first gymnasium. In this photo, you can better see Party Hall behind the stands and the old gym. And this old gymnasium was torn down to make way for Kirby Hall of Civil Rights. And just as an interesting aside, if you ever happen to be on the Vanderbilt campus, you can actually see our old gym in person because Vanderbilt built a twin gym on their campus and it still stands there to this day. And the wooden stands that you see in this photo, which you'll see right in front of Party Hall, they actually collapsed in the 1920s and several spectators were injured, which resulted in over $16,000 in damages. So larger and more substantial stands were needed, and the college was interested in building that, so there was a movement to build a stadium in concrete that gains momentum at this time. In 1926, a new stadium seating 18,000 spectators is constructed, and the largest crowd of the season, 15,000, is present for the rivalry game. Lafayette defeats Lehigh for the first time in Fisher Stadium, 35-0, but it's also our 8th consecutive win over the Brown. And the 1926 team under McCracken goes undefeated, and Lafayette wins its 3rd national championship. McCracken continues to lead the Leopards through the Depression when a drastic change in the number of our students occurs. By the fall of 1934, there were only about 800 enrolled students on campus, a drop of about 20% from the enrollment high of 1930. And intercollegiate athletics at Lafayette really faced a crisis. While basketball, baseball, and most of our minor sports recovered towards the end of the Depression, football continued to disappoint. And at the end of the 1935 season, after a crushing defeat by Lehigh in which we lose 48-0, Coach McCracken resigns. The college chooses Ernie Nevers, an All-American fullback from Stanford, to replace him. Nevers signs a 3-year contract, and during his first season in 1936, Lafayette won only 1 game, and it was not against Lehigh. Professor Finley Smith of the Electrical Engineering Department famously said that the brightest spot of Nevers' career coaching at Lafayette was his resignation after the first year. In 1937, Edward Hook Milan is hired and gives us 2 undefeated seasons, one in 1937 and then again in 1940. The 1937 team allowed only 1 touchdown the entire season and is called the Miracle Team, and Milan is dubbed the Miracle Coach. In 1940 and 41, under Coach Milan, the Lafayette Leopards handed the Engineers 2 resounding defeats, 46-0 and 47-7, respectively. The 1940 team was the 2nd undefeated team to play Coach Milan, but just 2 weeks after the 1941 game, Pearl Harbor quite literally was a game changer. World War II brought great disruption to college sports, as I'm sure you might imagine. Practically the entire athletic department went into active service with the armed forces. Coach Milan left to serve in the Army, and as the war progressed, there were fewer and fewer students left in residence to play intercollegiate sports. At other colleges, many athletic programs just shut down during the latter years of the war, but Lafayette came up with an interesting solution. They decided to suspend all minor intercollegiate sports while trying to maintain the major ones. To do this, for football, they relied on Lafayette's old rivals, Lehigh and Rutgers, and the group became known as the Middle Three. Agreeing to play each other twice a season, along with 2 additional games with other opponents, they were able to fill out seasons for 1943 and 1944. In the first game with Lehigh in 1944, before the smallest crowd of the century, only 400 people attended, Easton native Fred Peck Robbins scored 3 touchdowns to spark a 44-0 victory. And amazingly, in the second game that season, Robbins scored 5 touchdowns, a record that may still stand, as Lafayette handed Lehigh a resounding defeat, 64-0. The fraternity tradition of decorating houses for rivalry games develops during this period, and in this 1948 photograph, Lehigh drops another. And in 1948, the Lafayette victory over Lehigh before a crowd of 21,000, the largest to date, helped clinch a very successful season, which resulted in a bid to the Sun Bowl in El Paso, Texas for the Leopards. But there was a hitch. Lafayette's black halfback, David Scholl, a former Tuskegee Airman, was not going to be allowed to play in the segregated state-owned Texas Stadium. So Lafayette turned down the invitation. The Lafayette students held a rally protesting the situation, marched to downtown Easton, and fired off a telegram to President Harry Truman reading, "Denied Sun Bowl bid because we have a black player. Is this democracy?" In the 1950s and 60s, the Lafayette-Lehigh contests were a mixed bag. The 1955 game in a swirling snowstorm was a standout for Lafayette with the dazzling play of quarterback Joe Bozick, who led the Leopards to a 35-6 victory and the 50th win of the series. And here you can see the team celebrating with the coach. And here Joe Bozick shares a Coke in the Lehigh locker room after the game. And here's another famous photo from the 1950s. Lafayette is shaving L's on the heads of Lehigh students who were found tampering with the bonfire the night before the big game. In 1959, we were victorious again, 28-6, and the archives has a piece of the goalpost to prove it. And then in 1963, the Lafayette-Lehigh game was postponed for a week because of the Kennedy assassination, and it drew very few spectators that year. In 1964, the 100th meeting of Lafayette and Lehigh was played on Fisher Field with lots of fanfare and celebration of this great milestone. But to the disappointment of the organizers, it was not picked up to be televised on NBC. But we had a gala dinner in old alumni gym, a bonfire on the quad, and more fraternity house decorating contests. And these are all part of the 100th game festivities. Here's another shot. And another. This is actually Souls Hall, which was a social living dorm. After the 100th game kickoff, the co-captains of both teams are shown here, presenting the ball to Harvey Harmon, the president of the College Football Hall of Fame. And given the occasion, perhaps it was appropriate that the game ended in a 6-6 tie. Not all rivalry traditions are pretty. This fight broke out on the field after Lafayette loses to Lehigh 21-6 in 1968. But new traditions were on the horizon as Lafayette prepares for the arrival of women 2 years later. And as I'm sure many of you are well aware, Lafayette is in the midst of celebrating its 50th anniversary of coeducation this fall. Our first female students were admitted to the college in the fall of 1970. But coeducation didn't happen at Lafayette without much debate and study. Concerns from the Department of Athletics and the alumni centered on the health of the intercollegiate athletic program. Many were of the opinion that no fewer male students should result from coeducation. But in the end, a minimum of 500 women was regarded as necessary to maintain a viable coeducational community. So there was a reduction to 1,500 men, and there was a total of 2,000 students in the new enrollment model. A new but short-lived rivalry tradition developed in the 70s as women began to attend both Lafayette and Lehigh. An annual powder puff game between the female Leopards and Engineers takes place as part of the rivalry festivities. And at the first powder puff meeting, Lafayette's female students trounced Lehigh's 30-0, and the proceeds from ticket sales were donated to the Lehigh Valley Multiple Sclerosis Society. All in all, the 1970s was not a good decade for Lafayette football in terms of our rivalry with Lehigh. Despite some very creative Pink Panther-esque themed programs, from this particular time period. We have quite a few of these in the college archives. We only had 2 wins against Lehigh in that decade, and they were in 1970 and 1976. And at top on this slide, Rick Noel kicks the field goal that beat Lehigh in 1970. And at bottom is the highlight of the 1976 season. Lafayette beats Lehigh 21-17, breaking the 5-year domination held by our arch rival. And number 15 in this photo is MVP Mark Jones, who completed 9 of 13 passes for 161 yards and a touchdown. The 1981 game at Lehigh showcased Lafayette's brilliant defense. 3 interceptions and multiple sacks. Under new coach Bill Russo, we win 10-3, and the MVP goes to Leopards quarterback Frank Novak. Bill Russo turns out to be the Leopards' all-time winningest football coach from 1981 to 1999 with 103 victories. When Russo arrived at Lafayette as our 25th head coach, the team had only had moderate success for the 3 preceding decades. Russo's rookie season in 1981 was a triumph. The Leopards end up with a 9-2 record, and Russo was named District 2 Coach of the Year. And it's under Bill Russo's leadership that Lafayette moves to the Colonial League. In 1984, both Lafayette and Lehigh become charter members of the new league, founded by college presidents to promote the idea of the student athlete and awarding only need-based scholarships. In 1987, Frank Tavani arrives as offensive back coach the same year as the Tundra game. This was the last rivalry game to be played in Lehigh's Taylor Stadium before it was demolished. A wind chill of -17 degrees is reported, and Lehigh wins 17-10. But the next year, in 1988, which also happens to be my senior year at Lafayette, the rivalry game racked up a final score of 52-45 in favor of the Leopards. Lafayette's Frank Bauer threw for 309 yards, and he was later named to the first All-American team by the AP and others. His 64% completion record was the best in the country, even beating out Troy Aikman at UCLA. A Sports Illustrated issue featured Frank Bauer and acknowledged both his athletic and musical abilities. Frank Bauer and that 1988 football team go on to capture the league championship. Head coach Bill Russo receives the prestigious Eddie Robinson National Coach of the Year award after directing the highest scoring Division I AA football team in the nation. During the 1990-91 season, the Colonial League changes its name to the Patriot League. The 1990 rivalry on Fisher Field is particularly violent that year, post-game, and the next year, Lehigh officials replaced the usual wooden goal posts with metal ones that couldn't be broken into pieces. And this was an attempt to curb the chaos of the traditional goalpost rush after the game, and that usually ended up with goalpost fragments becoming revered relics for Lafayette and Lehigh fans alike. But students were enraged by those metal posts at that particular game, and they started throwing dirt at the police who were protecting the field. The police used mace against our students, and that was the violent end to a tradition. The following year at Lafayette, the kickoff time was set for 10:45 a.m. in the morning, and alcohol was more strictly regulated. It's also during this period of the rivalry that Lehigh pranks on our campus in anticipation of the game required the boxing of our great Daniel Chester French statue of the Marquis de Lafayette. This tradition doesn't seem to be necessary any longer. We haven't seen the Marquis boxed in many years. 1993 marks the first time the rivalry was broadcast on national TV. And in an effort to put our best face forward, the administration takes out this ad the week before the game in the Lafayette Student newspaper. And despite our students resulting good behavior at that game, we still suffer the indignity of Lehigh beating us on a national stage, 39-14. In 1994, Lafayette beats Lehigh 54-20 with the help of team captain Harrison Bailey, class of 1995. Bailey makes his 25th sack in the game and becomes Lafayette's all-time sack leader, a record that he still holds to this day. Frank Tavani is named Lafayette's 27th head coach in 1999. He becomes the Fred M. Kirby II, class of 1942 head football coach, an endowed position established in the summer of 2013 by the F.M. Kirby Foundation. And under Frank's leadership, we beat Lehigh in 4 straight games from 2004 to 2007. This slide features a quick rundown of those Lehigh thrashings, as well as our 2-time rivalry MVPs from this period, Jonathan Hurt and Brad Maurer. The 2007 win at Lehigh allowed the class of 2008 to leave College Hill without ever having to lose to its arch rival, a feat that has not been achieved since the class of 1950. And in 2013, the Leopards captured their first Patriot League title since 2006, hanging 50 points on arch rival Lehigh to secure the program's 7th Patriot League championship. And one of the most exciting rivalry years was in very recent history, the 150th meeting. The Lafayette community enjoyed preparing for the big game throughout the fall of 2014 with rivalry dance marathons, downtown East and pep rallies, and the annual rivalry Smack the Lehigh Car fundraiser for local cancer charities. And as I mentioned earlier, the 150th meeting took place in a very special venue in 2014, Yankee Stadium. Lafayette dominated Lehigh 27-7 before a sellout crowd of nearly 50,000 fans at Yankee Stadium. And that evening, the Empire State Building lit up in maroon and white to celebrate the Lafayette victory. In recent years, we've had an exciting new addition to our football tradition at Lafayette, John Garrett, our current head football coach. Coach Garrett led Lafayette to win our 155th meeting in Bethlehem last year. And who's going to help us beat Lehigh in the 156th meeting? How about Malik Ham, Patriot League Rookie of the Year in 2018, and the Patriot League Defensive Player of the Year in 2019. We know our student athletes are training hard and they're just as anxious to get back on the field as we are to get back into the stands. And for those of you who like to keep track, Lafayette still leads the rivalry series with 79 wins. And while we won't be able to gather at Fisher Field this November to witness our 80th win of the series, we wish Coach Garrett and his team the best as they prepare for the 156th meeting, which will hopefully be in 2021. And I'd like to just close today by thanking the Lafayette Student Alumni Council and Alumni Relations for inviting me to share the history of the rivalry with you all virtually this evening. And also special thanks to my colleagues in Lafayette College Athletics who have helped me interpret our football history over the years. And please remember to bring the roar by visiting roar.lafayette.edu. And if you enjoyed this sneak peek into the college archives, please consider designating a portion of your donation for the Friends of Skillman Library. The Friends support much of the Lafayette College Archives programming, our events, our digitization projects, and our exhibitions. And thank you so much for listening to me this evening. And I'll see you next year when we beat Lehigh.
Okay, thank you, Elaine. And now we'd like to invite anyone who has a question, please drop it in the chat feature at the bottom of your screen.
I was hoping there would be some questions because we invited Phil LaBella to be here to take any football related questions. So even if anyone has questions about the upcoming, hopefully the upcoming season or state of football and athletics, maybe Phil can answer some questions for us too.
So Elaine, I do see a question from Jan O'Sullivan, class of 77. And
Okay.
the question is, will not playing this game this year break the continuity of the rivalry streak? I guess the question is, like, if we don't play this year, are there other rivalries that may surpass us in most played games?
Not that I know of. I don't think that we're that close. In our entire series, we've only missed one game in 1896 because of that misunderstanding about the person who had played for the Chambersburg team. So that's the only year that we haven't played. So Phil might know how close the next most played rivalry is.
We definitely have a ways. I think it's probably 20 plus. The NCAA tends to weigh in on those things when it comes to streaks, and they kind of help determine. It seems like they've kind of gone through and made some special distinctions about statistics and things like that because of COVID. So we'll probably have to wait and see how they weigh in. But from a public relations standpoint, we're going to go with it until someone tells us no.
There is a question from Matt Forney. How many Patriot League championships have been won by the Leopards?
I'll let Phil answer that one because he probably.
7, I'm fairly certain. I think you covered that, Elaine. Pretty sure it was 7.
Yeah. I'm pretty sure it's 7 because that's only championships won while we were part of the Patriot League.
Mm-hmm.
So, but we've won 3 national championships before we were in the Patriot League.
Phil, we have a question from Rachel Mueller. Are you able to provide any history on the Burger Football House, as many of us have never been inside?
Phil, do you know the year that Burger opened?
I think it was completed in 06. I know it started, and obviously it was part of the whole stadium renovation project. As far as what's inside, it's not a secret. I can share that if we want to. There's a full team locker room. There's a full team workout facility. Certainly there is an auditorium type space if they want to have a full team meeting, or it can also be divided up into three sections for different parts of the team. The nice thing is that it houses everything there. Whereas a lot of other schools, they're kind of all spread out over different places. And when football moved out of Kirby Sports Center, it really allowed the coaches and the other sports in Kirby Sports Center to take over a lot of those spaces. So kind of, in some ways, without intentionally doing it, it really benefits some of our other programs too at the time, in terms of space. So it's really kind of the jewel of, when you look around Patriot League and Ivy League facilities, it's really, the jewel of those in terms of, football only facilities.
And one other thing to mention, I was just going to mention about Burger Football House. One other really special thing about it is on the second floor, there are beautiful cases that have recently been installed for all of our historic footballs. A number of those have gone out to a conservator out near Dickinson in Pennsylvania, who spent quite a bit of time restoring those important game balls. And those are all on display in Burger Football House.
Yeah, and I would just add, this is Mike McClintock, class of 1971. We can thank the Berger family, particularly my classmate and teammate, Jack Berger, for the Berger Football House. It truly is a wonderful facility. We can also thank them for largely, as well as the players who played for Harry Gamble, about the restoration, the collection and restoration of a lot of those footballs. And just one other thing I'd like to add, you commented on the non-football playing student activities following the 1968 game. And obviously that was a common occurrence in those days. But what you didn't mention, reason why I think there was a lot of excitement about that game was because we, the Lafayette team of 1968, came into that game with a 7-2 record, and we were #1 in the voting for the Lambert Cup, which was sort of like the mid-level thing for the best football team in the East. Unfortunately, we played Lehigh with a 2-7 record in the final game that year, and sadly, Lehigh beat us to allow Delaware to win the Lambert Cup. But having said that, the 7-3 record that 68 team achieved was the best record that the Lafayette football team had in 30 years. So just an add to the fight that went on afterwards.
Great. Yeah, well, thank you, Michael. And I just, let's zip back. Let's see. Does anyone recognize the people in this fight?
I wasn't there.
I'll give you, you weren't there. You weren't there yet.
Sad.
There you go. Yes, if anybody recognizes someone in this photo, please pop it in the chat.
We have another question from Greg McDonald. Since Lafayette normally hosts on even years, who will host in 2021 if we do get to play?
That was a question I had, and I'm hoping that we still get to play at Fisher Field, but maybe Phil can weigh in on that.
I wish I could weigh in on that. There are just, there's so many things that need to be talked about and discussed. I know I saw there were a couple other questions about a possibility of a spring season within Patriot League schools. I mean, there are a lot of things being talked about right now, and so many of them are obviously dependent upon the situation in the country, and there's nothing really can give up more than that other than to say that there are a lot of options and we're all hopeful. Let me put it that way.
It would be great if we could have 2 games in 2021, one in the spring and one in the fall. We would each get to play and bring back the tradition of playing twice in 1 year. I'm going to move off this slide. There.
Okay, so thank you, Elaine, and thank you to our audience for joining us this evening. This week is the Bring the Roar Giving Challenge. To learn more and to make your gift, please visit roar.lafayette.edu. And thank you for joining us for our presentation tonight.
Oh, one last thing. I just wanted to let it, we will be rebroadcasting the 150th on Saturday evening at 7 p.m. And you can check Leopard Link for the link. I believe it's going to be playing on goleopards.com at 7 p.m. We'll be rebroadcasting the 150th.